Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hanadi Jordan, Communications Coordinator at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In today's episode, we're going to discuss the federal government's lawsuit against Texas Governor Greg Abbot over the placement of buoys to deter migrants from crossing the Rio Grande River. We'll also cover the increased rhetorical fight between the mayor of New York City and the Biden administration over the large number of migrants that have arrived to the city. And with a government shutdown looming, we're going to cover what this means for DHS and the border. All this when we come back, so stay tuned. As part of its so-called Operation Lone Star initiative, the state of Texas, under Republican Governor Greg Abbott, has spent millions of dollars on various efforts to stop what the governor has termed an invasion of migrants across the Texas-Mexico border. Governor Abbott has deployed Texas National Guard troops and the Texas Department of Public Safety officers to the border, has arrested and prosecuted migrants on private lands under state trespassing statutes, bused thousands of migrants to cities including New York, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and Chicago, and constructed additional border barriers along the Texas border, including stringing razor wire across sections of the shore of the Rio Grande River. Then, in July of this year, the governor escalated his efforts by deploying more than 1,000 feet of buoys as a floating barrier in the river itself near Eagle Pass, Texas. After several letters from the federal government to Abbott alleging the buoys violated federal water laws and international treaties with Mexico, the Justice Department sued Abbott and the state in a federal district court in Austin to have them removed. Joining us now to break it all down is This Week regular Theresa Cardinal Brown. Theresa, are you ready to dive in?
Certainly.
All right. So, Theresa, for those who aren't so familiar with the Texas border buoys, what are some quick essential facts they should know about the matter? What are the primary reasons that drove Texas to install these buoys in the first place?
Sure. So, as you said in your opening, the governor of Texas has launched this Operation Lone Star for the last several years, claiming that the Biden administration in particular has not effectively secured the border from illegal migration. And so they have used Texas state resources to do things like, as you mentioned, send personnel and troops, but also install various forms of barriers to prevent migrants from physically entering the United States, starting with razor wire along the shores of the Rio Grande River in South Texas. And the border buoys were sort of an escalation of that. Now, when we think of maybe waterway buoys, you think of a little kind of small thing bobbing in the water, maybe if you're on a major waterway, sort of the metal ones that are aids to navigation. But these buoys are large air-filled plastic drums that are between 4 and 6 feet in diameter and probably, 5 or 6 feet in length that are strung together on metal cables. In between each buoy is a large circular steel disc that looks basically like a circular saw blade because it's jagged around the edges. These buoys, it's 1,000 feet of these in the Rio Grande River near Eagle Pass, Texas, and they are put into the river by cranes because they weigh several tons and anchored to the bottom of the river by large cement blocks along the length. So these barriers really are, first of all, they're in the waterway, away from the shore, and they are meant to prevent people from getting to the shore. Now, something to remember about the border in this area is that the actual geographical border and legal border between the United States and Mexico in this place is in the middle of the river. So someone who crosses the river, even before they step foot on U.S. soil, is in U.S. territory. And so I believe that one of the purposes from Governor Abbott is to prevent migrants from actually getting to the U.S. side of the river. And it was the federal government said, wait a minute, you can't, the Rio Grande is a navigable waterway. It's international waters. You can't just put something there without permission from the federal government. They also had received complaints from the government of Mexico that some of these barriers were actually on the Mexican side of the river. And furthermore, we have treaties with Mexico regulating that waterway because both countries share access to the water resources. So there's actually a commission called the International Boundary and Water Commission. That's a binational US Mexico commission that regulates that river and also has authority over what can be placed and where, and even along the shores of it that might divert the river or change the flow so that each side does not have access to the water it's entitled to.
So you mentioned that the intention behind this was to deter migration. What has the impact of that been? Has it been effective?
It's not across the whole Rio Grande River, so migrants are still entering around the ends of it. There have been migrants that have attempted to swim up, to go climb over it, and some have been injured. There have been some deaths. It's unclear if the deaths are attributable to the buoys themselves. You can't swim under it because there's netting between the buoys and the floor of the river. The other thing, though, is that federal government officials do patrol the river on boats, both to arrest migrants and deter them. So do state and local government officials. So do pleasure boats. And so one of the questions about this was, is it a barrier to actually the law enforcement operations of the Border Patrol or CBP who operate boats along this stretch of the river? And the federal government argued, yes, it was. So I think there definitely have been those kinds of impacts. And again, has it deterred migration? Well, by the numbers, not necessarily, because migrants are going to other parts along the border.
So you mentioned it's impacted border security operations, but I'm curious, what have been the challenges in maintaining and managing these buoy systems?
Well, they haven't been in place all that long. It's been since July. And once they are in place, there's not a lot that needs to be done to maintain them unless there's been efforts to injure them in some way. So cutting through the cables or through the netting. We've seen this with other border barriers. So the walls and fences, every day, Border Patrol finds places where they have been cut, they have been deteriorated, or attempts have been made to go through them. There's millions of dollars the federal government puts in place to actually repair border barriers that it has put in place along the border. So we know that these things are not permanent. And again, they've not been in place that long. So as far as I know, they haven't had movement. Again, they're pretty anchored to the bottom of the river, so they're not going to move very far. But that is one of the concerns.
Are there any concerns about the environmental and ecological impact of the buoys? And if so, how are those concerns being addressed?
Well, I mentioned the International Boundary and Water Commission, and certainly one of their charges is to make sure that nothing impedes the flow of the water in the Rio Grande Channel. So, for example, the commission had objections to some of the fencing that was built on private property along the Rio Grande River because the fear was that when rains came, it would impede the flow of the river and or divert water that was supposed to go either on the US side or the Mexico side. Again, remember, both countries have access to the water in that river for whatever uses we put for water. And erosion of the banks can change the waterway. And I think so there was concern about just how this buoy setup would impact the flow of the water and the river and the usefulness of the river.
So it seems like over the past 2 years, the governor of Texas has consistently challenged the federal government's authority on matters concerning immigration. Now, the Biden administration is actively taking a stance by suing the state. But why now? Why after all this time? Is it really just specific to the buoys? Are there other considerations? Why today?
So there were some lawsuits over some of the private fencing. Some of those were generated by local governments, some of the International Boundary Water Commission. I think this is the highest profile lawsuit. This is being brought by the Department of Justice against the governor of Texas, and it was brought relatively quickly. The lawsuit was filed in August. The buoys were put in place in July. I think there's a couple reasons why this one was they took action on it so quickly, and why it's sort of high profile. One is that it certainly is an escalation of the efforts of the Abbott administration, and Governor Abbott himself made a really big public show of doing this and almost taunted the Biden administration to come after him. I think he very much was looking for a lawsuit to challenge all of this in federal court. But the other thing is, as I mentioned, this is an international waterway. And the government of Mexico sent diplomatic notes to the government of the United States charging that, one, the buoys were on Mexican territory, which would be a violation of Mexican sovereignty, and two, that it was violating the treaties that they had. And so this quickly became not just a domestic spat between a governor of a state and the US presidency, but a international issue and a foreign policy issue. And as we've talked about here, the United States government needs Mexico for a lot of things right now. Obviously, Mexico is one of our largest trading partners. We have millions of dollars of trade and travel that goes back and forth, binational citizenship. There's lots of great, strong relationships there. But fundamentally on migration, the United States needs the cooperation of the Mexican government in order to manage migration at the border right now. And so anything that would challenge the relationship in a way that might impact that is something the United States government is going to take pretty seriously. So my supposition is those are the primary reasons why the federal government filed this lawsuit. They sent a cease and desist letter to the governor, I think within days after the buoys were put in place. And, the lawsuit was filed shortly thereafter as well.
Before we dive further into the, foreign policy implications of this issue, I'm curious about the outlines of the arguments that each side is making in this case. As you said, sort of Governor Abbott might have been looking for a lawsuit, which seems to me like he might be pretty confident. So what are his arguments in this case, and what are the federal government's arguments?
So let's start with the federal government's arguments. The federal government charged that there are federal laws governing navigable waters in the United States. The federal government, through the Coast Guard and other authorities, is responsible for ensuring that they can be traversed by commercial and pleasure traffic. This is an international waterway. There are federal laws governing what can be done along, in, or around this waterway. It also, as an international boundary, again, we have a treaty with Mexico that is enshrined in U.S. law that also implicates this. So basically, they charged the governor with installing an impediment in the river without obtaining proper permits or permissions from the federal government to do so. And that violated these federal laws. Governor Abbott argued that instead of needing federal government permission to do this on these laws, that he was preventing the state of Texas from an invasion. Now, there's a section of the Constitution that says that when the federal government has not protected a state from foreign invasion, the state may take action. And this is the primary legal position the state of Texas is taking, Governor Abbott is taking, that the arrival of these migrants across the U.S.-Mexico border in Texas constitutes an invasion for the purposes of this clause in the Constitution. It's a novel argument. Many legal scholars have said that calling what is happening an invasion in that terminology is not a very strong legal argument, but it's one that not just Governor Abbott, but many, I'd say, immigration hawks, and certainly organizations, especially those that are aligned with former President Trump, have promulgated this legal theory of the case, that states do have authorities under the Constitution, even when the federal government has preemptive authority on immigration. In this case, by arguing that's an invasion, the state has more authority to take action.
Well, the district court in Texas initially ordered the removal of the buoys. What led to that initial decision?
So the case was brought in a federal district court in Austin, Texas. Many followers of this podcast who have followed the many different times the state of Texas has sued the U.S. federal government will recognize that Austin is not one of the places that Texas usually tries to file their lawsuits. They have filed in the Southern District of Texas. They've filed in Northern District of Texas, in part because the way the federal judiciary is set up in Texas and the way Texas, you can do a little bit more what's called forum shopping in Texas. There are federal districts in Texas that have a tiny number or even a single judge. And given that you're suing the state, you can sue anywhere in the state in federal court if you're suing the state or the state is suing the federal government. So the DOJ picked Austin and thought they would get a more sympathetic judge in Austin, and they did. And the judge issued a preliminary temporary restraining order against Texas, telling them they had to remove the buoys. And in so doing, essentially said that the state of Texas arguments were not valid, that the federal government clearly had the case on its side, because in order to issue a temporary restraining order, the judge has to believe or show that the plaintiff, in this case, the federal government, is likely to succeed on the merits when the case is heard out fully. So this is an initial order. And the judge was pretty scathing toward the Texas arguments here, and said they have really no basis, and ruled and said it's likely that Department of Justice would prevail, and so ordered the buoys removed. He did stay his order for about a week. I think everybody presumed it would be appealed. The Governor Abbott has said he wants to take this case to the Supreme Court because he wants this issue of whether or not that constitutional provision applies. He wants the Supreme Court to take this up because he believes, I guess, and so do some others, that the Supreme Court would agree with them.
Well, let's talk about the foreign policy implications of this issue. As you outlined in your overview of the federal government's arguments in this case, they're saying that this has serious foreign policy implications for their relationship with Mexico and that it's violating a treaty with the U.S. and Mexico. So can you break down what those implications are and what this means for our relationship with Mexico?
Yeah. So before I go there, I should mention that the judge in Austin, Texas' temporary order was overturned by an appeals court the following week. Actually, I think the following days. So the buoys are still in the Rio Grande River right now. They, while the case is proceeding, they're still there. So, more to come. But I think, as I alluded to before, the United States and Mexico have a lot of issues that they're dealing with right now. Obviously, we have a large trading relationship. We, being physical, geographical neighbors, we have a lot of things that we do together. Under the Trump administration, we just renegotiated the U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement. So there's a lot of issues that just regularly come up between the U.S. and Mexican government. But a key issue right now is the management of migration. And even going back to the Trump administration, the U.S. government and the presidents have acknowledged that they need Mexico's help to manage migration at the border because the migrants are coming through Mexico. And they're largely not Mexican, although that is shifting a little bit. More Mexicans are coming as well. The relationship between the United States and Mexico on migration has ebbed and flowed for many, many years. I think going back into the 1990s, when most of the migration coming across the border was of Mexican nationals, the Mexican government took a position that they had no authority to prevent their own citizens from emigrating, from leaving. And that created some tension with the U.S. government for many years. When President George W. Bush was elected, he was previously governor of Texas. And at the same year, Mexico elected for the first time a president who was not of a party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI, that had ruled Mexico for a very long time. So it was two presidents who came from a border area and had known each other previous. And so they had a relationship, and they came in with the idea that we need to change how we talk about migration in both countries, that this is a shared responsibility for managing migration, for orderliness at the border. That shifted things. And I think since then, to a greater or lesser extent, the United States and Mexico have tried to cooperate on migration. A lot of our migration issues are congressional issues that can't necessarily be dealt with just by the president. But coming into office, President Trump really asked Mexico to crack down more on the non-Mexican migrants that were coming up through Mexico, primarily from the Central American countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And he threatened tariffs on Mexican goods to get that to happen. This was before the USMCA was renegotiated. And Mexico agreed. So they agreed to take back those nationals who were, they agreed first to the migrant protection protocols, remain in Mexico policy. They agreed after Title 42 was issued to take people back from those countries under Title 42. Through the Biden administration, they've agreed to take back nationals of other countries, such as Venezuela, Nicaragua, Haiti, and Cuba, when the Biden administration also agreed to create more legal pathways. So this is a dynamic, ongoing, I think, daily set of conversations and negotiations between the United States and Mexico. The actions of the governor of Texas were immediately repudiated by the government of Mexico, not just on the grounds that it violated Mexican sovereignty and the treaty, but Mexico still sees itself as a protector of migrants, at least rhetorically and from a governmental sense. And it argued against the humanitarian issues here, that these are dangerous items that you're basically threatening migrants' lives with. And that was another reason why Mexico was very upset with this. And so, there's lots of issues on a daily basis, but I think that, again, the reliance that the United States government has placed on Mexico to help manage migration at the border is large. It's a big issue for the government. Politically, it's a big issue. We all know this. And this was a much more direct threat to that relationship than I think the previous actions that Governor Abbott had taken, which were more directed at President Biden, the federal government, the Democrats in the White House, but also by busing people to Democratic cities and that kind of thing, making it much more partisan. But this was a direct implication to the U.S.-Mexico relationship in a way that I think those previous actions were not.
I'm wondering how these actions might also impact Texas's relationship with federal border agencies like Customs and Border Protection. Has it had any impact? Do you anticipate it having any impact?
I would say that on any given day, the relationship between, say, Customs and Border Protection, the agency and its Washington headquarters, which is obviously under the jurisdiction of President Biden and the government of Texas, may be different than the relationship between, say, a Border Patrol sector chief in Texas and local officials in the state of government in Texas, because they have to work together on a regular basis operationally. And so I think for the most part, on the ground, agents and officers at the state and federal level try to work together, try to manage these things without getting too embroiled in the politics. That having been said, when there are operational issues, and there are some operational issues, as I mentioned, with CBP being able to drive its boats along the river with the buoys in place, that can create those kinds of frictions. In which case, I think everybody's sort of like, okay, we got to let the higher ups figure this out for us. But it can create those kinds of tensions from time to time. I think that there's a incentive on the ground to try to work together as much as possible.
What about the communities and residents around and near the river? How have they responded to the presence of the buoys? Are they concerned at all?
Well, to the extent that they like to go up and down the river for fishing or boating or recreation or anything else, yeah, that's something they don't like. Otherwise, I think at least on the Texas side, it kind of depends on where they fall on the issue of migration, right? If they are happy with the Texas governor's efforts to kind of stop migrants from coming across, particularly landowners who have land that are right on the Rio Grande, regardless of their feeling about migration as an issue or the migrants themselves, they see property destruction and trespassers on their property and that kind of stuff, and that they're not happy with it. So I think, again, it's not black and white. It's a little bit more complex than that. There's a sense at which it interrupts what has been going on along that river in terms of locals using it for recreation and fishing and other things that they do. that had already been partially disrupted by the migration that's happening. On the Mexican side, locals are involved in the smuggling. They're making money off of it in some ways. And so, that even though it's an illegal act, it's a business in some ways. So again, when you get on the ground, a lot of these issues just become a lot more complicated.
You mentioned earlier that the initial decision to have the buoys removed was overturned. Can you provide some insight into that choice?
I think the appeals court looked at what the judge in Austin did, and I think said that the judge in Austin overestimated the chances of success of the Department of Justice. I don't think they weighed in specifically on everything, but I do think that they thought there was probably more at play here than what the judge in Austin had said for a temporary restraining order. And again, they're not ruling yet on the actual merits of the claims. It's a little, again, this is the law, and the law can be kind of weird in times. So as I mentioned, to issue a temporary restraining order, the judge has to believe that the plaintiffs, in this case the Justice Department, are likely to succeed in their claims when all of the briefs are held, the oral arguments are held, and all of the merits are examined. But the merits haven't yet been examined, and there's still room for the lower court to change its mind once all that happens. The appeals court, I think, said that that idea that the Justice Department was likely to win on all the merits may have been an overstatement. So again, it just goes back to the lower court, and now they get to hear all those arguments from both sides, the full legal briefs, the full oral arguments, a chance to question everybody, and we'll see if the lower court judge changes their mind.
Well, how do you anticipate this case playing out? As you mentioned, Abbott and others are kind of hoping that this reaches the Supreme Court. Do you think it will?
Again, I think they will try to. The Supreme Court is unique among the federal judiciary in that they get to decide whether or not to hear a case. There's no obligation on the Supreme Court just because you ask them to take an appeal, they will. So it really will kind of depend on what the lower courts rule. Certainly it will be appealed. Whatever the first court says, no matter who loses that side, will be appealed, in this case to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And again, depending on what that appeal states, I think if the government loses, they might take it to the Supreme Court. If Abbott loses, he will try to take it to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court will have to look at the case and say, is this ready for us to weigh in on? And there are lots of considerations they have on that. Is it a big enough issue? If there is a real constitutional question, that makes it maybe a little more likely that they weigh in. But they also go, is this question really ripe for us to look at yet? Or did the lower courts do a decent enough job looking at this stuff and ruling on it that we don't need to come in yet? There are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. They get to vote to decide whether or not to take up the cases. So I can't really say what they will do. But that could be years from now. And, as we've said a lot of times on this podcast, this is the fate of all of this litigation around immigration. It can change things very quickly on the ground as one court rules and another court overrules, and then it goes back on a temporary basis, and then the merits hearings and back and forth and back and forth. But it's not solved. It's not done for years. And it may be into another administration if Biden is not reelected that this gets solved. Many cases from the Trump years are still pending in federal courts that the Biden administration is having to manage. So we talk about it right now because it has real on the ground implications. But the reality is that the fate of these buoys may not be decided for months, if not years to come.
Yeah. So I guess all of our listeners have to hang tight while we wait to see how this plays out. Thank you, Theresa. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the growing tensions between the mayor of New York City and the Biden administration over the arrival of migrants from the border. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Between the spring of 2022 and the fall of 2023, more than 110,000 migrants have been bused from Texas and Florida to New York City, straining the city's resources and causing the mayor of New York, Democrat Eric Adams, to take an increasingly alarmist tone with the Biden administration over its handling of the situation, including demanding the federal government reimburse the city for the estimated $12 billion spent out of its budget to house and provide financial support to the arriving migrants, and that the administration grant work authorization to the migrants faster so that they can work and decrease their reliance on city resources. Democratic New York Governor Kathy Hochul has also been urging the Biden administration to do more to help the state and city with the migrant crises. Once again, to talk about this growing rift between these prominent Democrats is Theresa Cardinal Brown. Theresa, welcome back again.
We're here. It's just you and me this week, but there's lots to talk about.
There is a lot to talk about. So on April 13th of 2022, Governor Abbott sent the first bus with at least 25 migrants from Central and South America to Washington, D.C. Governor Abbott's administration noted in June 2023 that Texas had bused more than 10,000 migrants to D.C. since then, another 8,200 to New York City, 2,600 to Chicago, and 1,600 to Philadelphia, all cities with Democratic mayors. Still, New York has said that it has received more than 100,000 migrants. So is this all about Governor Abbott and his busing, or is there something else going on here?
So I think it started with Governor Abbott and his busing. And if you go back to 2022, it was widely seen as a political stunt. The buses that arrived in Washington, D.C. were dropped off migrants outside of Vice President Kamala Harris's house. So in a place, it was clearly to make a point. And the governor said, I'm sending these migrants to the sanctuary cities because if they want migrants so much, they can have them, right? Yeah. It was to kind of poke them, literally, politically, and in reality. And they were sent without any notice to the cities they were arriving. And in many cases, they were just unceremoniously dropped off in places, random places in the city, without anything. They came, they didn't have any money. They had no place to go in many cases. They had accepted the offer of the state of Texas to send them because they didn't know where else to go. And here was a free bus ride. Now, there have been questions about whether or not the migrants were lied to or otherwise tricked into, or maybe even, if not forcibly put on the buses, at the very least tricked into doing so. But over time, I think what happened, and this is particularly true of New York, other organizations that have been busing migrants, such as nonprofit organizations, when they're released from CBP custody and they don't have any money, they go to these shelters, and nonprofit organizations will use their monies to help them reach their destination elsewhere in the United States, whether it's to meet family or friends or wherever it is they choose to go. The city of El Paso and the county of El Paso for a time was also chartering buses. Again, the idea is they feel, unlike Governor Abbott that is trying to stick it in the eye of these Democratic governors, in these cases, they believe they were doing the migrants a service by trying to help them reach places where they were trying to get to. What happened in New York is that, first of all, every migrant in the world, every person in the world sees the Statue of Liberty in New York and understands that that's a symbol of welcome for migrants, for immigrants, right? So New York City has an international reputation as a welcoming city for immigrants. But also practically, New York City has policies and laws in some cases that offer more supports, including housing for those who can't support themselves. Initially, these policies were to deal with homelessness. We're not necessarily about migrants per se, but the migrants who arrived who didn't have a place to go could take advantage of them. And I think as that word traveled back amongst the migrant networks, New York City became a place that migrants wanted to go because they knew if they went there, they would be taken care of. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's less now about Governor Abbott busing migrants and more just about the number of arrivals to New York has strapped the city's resources to provide the services that, in some cases, they're required by law to do.
So I think that leads into my next question, which is, initially, of course, Mayor Adams was critical of Abbott for busing migrants up to New York. But now a lot of this criticism has also shifted toward President Biden. Can you talk more about that and what the White House's response has been?
So I think what happened was that the mayor of New York City, the governor of New York City, and to a lesser extent, mayors of other cities that have been receiving migrants said to the federal government, these people are here because your administration allowed them to enter the United States. You process them at the border and release them. They are not illegally in the United States. I think that's something that we need to make clear.
Yeah.
They have been processed by the federal government. They are here with the government's permission while their case makes its way through immigration court, while it's determined whether or not they will ultimately be able to stay. And that is a federal government responsibility. And they are asking the federal government to essentially help pay for this situation that the federal government is responsible for. Similar arguments had been made by the cities and towns along the US-Mexico border that had been providing services to migrants that were arriving there for years. And in fact, the federal government, under the Federal Emergency Management Agency, has a program called the Emergency Food and Shelter Program that had been used to help reimburse some of these states and nonprofit organizations for the work they were doing to help these migrants after they'd been released from federal custody. New York City was demanding essentially the same thing, but on a bigger scale. And the other cities are asking for it as well. Last year, Congress allocated additional money for what they're now calling the Shelter and Services Program, or the SSP. And New York has gotten money from the federal government, but its outlays are far exceeding the millions of dollars that it has already received. So it was looking for additional help, both monetarily and now increasingly recognizing that the migrants aren't able to support themselves because they don't have work authorization. And so they're reliant on city services for longer, are asking the Biden administration to give them the ability to work legally in the United States. Now, that's a different set of circumstances because now they're not just asking for money, they're asking for a benefit that the administration has to figure out how, under its authorities, can it grant this benefit, and if so, how?
Well, there's been a lot of speculation surrounding the extent to which migrants have consented to being bused to these cities. I remember a while back there was that whole issue with Martha's Vineyard where migrants said that they did not consent. And so, what are the facts around this? Do the migrants have informed consent? Can they opt out of being bused if they wish to? Is it on a volunteer basis? Is it mandatory? Tell us what's going on.
So I would say it's still somewhat muddled. And part of that muddling is that the migrants themselves, it happens quickly. They go through lots of trauma just getting to the US-Mexico border. Then they're processed relatively quickly out of government custody. Most of them don't have any money to their name. They don't really understand what's happening to them. They know they've just finally made it to America. And what happens next, they don't know. One thing I will mention that has changed in the years since we've been dealing with the migrant crisis at the border is that while initially, when we saw the Central American migration as sort of the new majority migration, most of them had relatives, family, friends, or support networks somewhere in the United States that they were trying to get to. And so when they arrived, they had a couch to crash on. They had people that were willing to help them with food and help them find a job, even people to help them find somebody to help them file their cases in court. Many of the new migrants, particularly migrants from Venezuela, but also from Nicaragua, they have no one in the United States. They are literally coming with nothing and to nothing other than the idea that America is the place where they can find safety and security. And so they are more reliant on these government services than previous waves of migration at the border. And this is new. This is newer. And so I do think that the question of whether or not they are consenting to get on the buses, I think if you don't have any idea where you're going to go in the United States, you really don't understand what just happened to you. And somebody says, I can give you a free bus ticket to New York City. Even if you know nothing else about the United States, you've heard of New York City and you know New York City is an immigrant place. Well, I'll go to New York City. It's a big city. I can probably find work there and somebody will help me. And then as I mentioned, the migrants that have been there before, there's a migrant network, right? There are Facebook groups and apps, app group chats, and there's just social media has enabled so much more information flow to migrants from other migrants. So they are seeing and hearing, oh, well, the folks who went 2 weeks before me ended up in New York City and they were given a hotel room and food and they were taken care of. So if I arrive with nothing and I'm offered a ticket to New York City, I will take it. That having been said, many of them really don't know what they're coming to. And there have been other circumstances. You mentioned the flight to Martha's Vineyard, which was actually the state of Florida orchestrated that for a group of migrants in San Antonio, Texas. And there is ongoing investigation about whether or not there was criminal activity involved there, that the migrants had been misled. Similar, some of the buses to California, there was some question about whether the migrants understood what was going on, that they were given information to go to an office building, and that people there would help them, and whether or not that was committing a fraud against them. So I would say there are active investigations about whether or not there was criminal activity involved in some of this. But I also think that there's just a lot of desperate people in desperate circumstances who are looking for any sort of help they get. And when offered it, will take it.
I'm wondering why these cities specifically, like why are these migrants being bused to New York, DC, Chicago? You mentioned that we're sort of seeing this new wave of migrants who are just trying to make it to the US, don't necessarily have people here that they're trying to reach who can help support them. Is it because these cities offer more of the services that they require? Is it more political? Is it just because these cities are democratic? What are the reasons why these migrants are being bused there?
So, to the extent that the buses are being funded by the state of Texas, it is definitely about sending them to Democratic cities.
Yeah.
The governor of Texas and many Republicans are, finding it very, very ironic that the Democratic governors of these cities who have talked for a long time about how welcoming they are to immigrants are suddenly saying, no, enough, right? They're making a lot of political hay over that.
Yeah.
But I think, in the other sense, Washington, D.C., New York, and Chicago are some of the biggest cities in the United States. And many of the Venezuelans, unlike I think a lot of the Central American migrants who tended to come from more rural areas, these are urbanites. They lived in cities in Venezuela or cities in other countries in South America. And so a city is where they want to go because that's what they're used to. And they're like I said, they're likely to find services. They're likely to find work. They just think it's a better place for them to be than a place that they never heard of, right? So while, again, the Central Americans that came earlier, if you think about where Salvadorans, Hondurans, Guatemalans, and others have settled, their diaspora, their previous generations of migrants have spread throughout the country. So they're in we call secondary migration cities now. They're not in like the biggest immigrant receiving centers anymore. They've gone to other places because that's where the work is. But if you don't have that network, then you're going to these sort of first reception cities. And all of these cities, Washington, D.C. is maybe a little bit different, but definitely New York and Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, Houston, like these have been immigrant receiving cities for years and years and years and years. And so there is a sense in which they have an infrastructure that could receive immigrants and integrate them because they've shown that they can do that for generations. What's happening here is the speed at which new arrivals are coming, because that's new. Migrants have been coming to New York City for hundreds of years. We know this, but they didn't, very rarely did they come in such large numbers in such a short period of time. And anytime you have that happen, that's going to tax the support systems that have been in place for generations to help immigrants. And I think that's the challenge that we have right now. It's simply that the number of arrivals in such a short period of time has overwhelmed the capacity of these cities, the same way the arrival of the migrants has overwhelmed the capacity of our immigration system, the asylum system, the immigration court system. It is true that the number of people coming and the speed with which they're coming is just overtaxing our capacities. And that has to be recognized as a very serious issue that we have not been able to address.
Yeah, I think our listeners will be curious to know if you can just provide a quick outline of what is contributing to this larger wave of migration, more so than we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I mean, we've said it here before, but and the Biden administration tries to say this every chance they get, but it's not necessarily breaking through. There is a record number of people migrating throughout the world right now, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, but everywhere around the world. The United Nations has said there are more displaced people in the world right now than at any time since World War II. Millions and millions of people. And even if we just talk about Venezuela, 7.2 million Venezuelans have left Venezuela in the last decade alone. Most of them have not come to the United States. Most of them are living in other countries in Central America, although they're starting to move north. But that's larger than the number of Ukrainians displaced. That's larger than the number of Syrians displaced. So it's massive, and it's in our hemisphere. So we have to recognize that there are situations that have happened that have nothing to do with U.S. immigration policy, that are causing people to leave, to seek safety, to seek security, both personal security, family security, but economic security. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are eligible for the legal definition of asylum, but that's what's causing them to migrate in the first place. And once they have made that decision that they can't stay where they are, that to stay would mean that they or their children would starve or die or be killed, then that's already gotten them to move, right? They're already on the move. And then it's a matter of where do they go and where do they end up? And our policies are going to be less relevant to that decision than that overwhelming need that I've got to move. And I think we really need to recognize that, because we focus a lot on what's our policy at the border. Are we letting people in, or are we keeping people out? And that is part of it, but it's not really the fundamental cause of this migration. It is something that can affect what happens after they come, but its ability to affect whether they come or not, I think, is less strong. And it's also, I think, worth saying that our system for greeting migrants who are seeking that kind of protection was not designed for this level of migration this rapidly. And Congress needs to weigh in on that, because administrations don't have the authority to change that part of the system.
Yeah, I think that's something you've made clear over and over again in this podcast and interviews with media, that a large piece of addressing this crisis involves addressing the factors that are driving migrants out of their home countries. But quickly want to pivot back to this busing issue. Mayor Adams and Governor Hochul have publicly requested President Biden to provide a path to expedited work authorizations for newly arrived migrants so that they can work legally. And as of this recording, on September 21st, we know last night the administration announced expanded TPS for Venezuelans. So firstly, Theresa, why do they feel that work authorization is so important to addressing the crisis. And now that the Biden administration has expanded TPS for Venezuelans, what will the impact of that look like in places like New York?
Sure. So, as I described, one of the unique factors that New York City has, and New York State as well, is they have a law that's called a right to housing law. And under this law, anyone who finds themselves homeless or unhoused has the right to ask the city for shelter. And so the city must provide them a place to sleep. And the city has been doing this for years and years and years. This has been on the book for quite some time. But it had not been something that had been largely used by, as I said, previous waves of migrants who weren't necessarily finding themselves without a house. They were received in communities in the city that had, were welcoming them or had expected their arrival. This group, particularly the Venezuelans, but to a lesser extent some other nationalities, did not have that. And so they did find themselves sleeping on the streets, in parks, outside bus stations and whatever. And so the city, and immigration advocates said, well, the city is required to provide housing to people who don't have a bed. So the city must do that. So the city very quickly found all of its existing shelter space taken up by migrants and had to look for other shelter space. So they started putting people up in hotels, and then they ran out of hotel space that they could do. They were looking to whether or not they could put them up on campsites on islands outside of New York City. They started busing them to other parts of the state, to hotels in other parts of the state, because they just ran out of capacity. And they find that the migrants are in need of these shelters for longer because they don't have the ability to work. And so their ask was, well, we have lots of job openings in New York State that these migrants could be doing. Why can't we give them work authorization while they're waiting on their asylum claim? Aren't they eligible for work authorization if they're asylum seekers anyway? Can we expedite that? And so then they can work and they'd be able to get themselves out of and support themselves and leave these shelter situations. The challenge there for the Biden administration is a little bit law and a little bit politics and a little bit operational policy. So yes, by law, someone who has filed an application for asylum can ask for work authorization, but not until 6 months after that application is filed. So for brand new arrivals into the country, they haven't yet filed that application. They need to get help, for the most part, to file that application for asylum in an immigration court or with USCIS, and then they have to wait 6 months before they can ask for employment authorization. So, step one is filing that asylum claim, and that can take many months to get to there, and then another 6 months before you can get work authorization. That could be up to a year or more if you don't, aren't able to find help to do that. So that's that, and that is by law. That's Congress passed that law, that 6 months waiting period. Now, there are other avenues in which the administration can grant certain people work authorization. So, for example, those who have been paroled into the country under the Cuban, Nicaraguan, Venezuelan, or Haitian programs, or those who've been processed through ports of entry with an appointment in the CBP One app are eligible to apply for work authorization immediately. But they may not know that, right? These are arcane parts of U.S. immigration law, right? They don't know that. And so either they haven't yet gotten to the point in their asylum claim where they can file work authorization, or if they're eligible for work authorization because they've been paroled, then they don't know that they can file, and they haven't done so yet. The other challenge is that USCIS has a huge backlog of employment authorization requests for existing temporary protected status holders, for DACA recipients, for people who have applied for green cards, for a whole slew of categories of people for whom they issue these documents. And so even if they were to find a way to expedite this, they have to have the capacity to process it. This is one of the reasons that created a lot of friction, because initially the Biden administration told the mayor and governor, we can't do that. Other people got involved. Some creativity in immigration law and policy was figured out. And one of the responses was this TPS designation. So Venezuela had been designated for temporary protected status for more than a year. Temporary protected status is not a visa status. It is what it says. It's temporary protection from deportation. It does grant people work authorization. It is valid only so long as the government recognizes a circumstance that means that nationals of that country can't go back to that country. Natural disaster, governmental disturbance, civil war or strife. Those are some of the reasons why TPS can be granted. So Venezuela was granted TPS, but it only applies to people who are already in the United States at the time the designation is made. So since the designation for TPS for Venezuela was made a couple years ago, hundreds of thousands of more Venezuelans have entered the country who are not eligible for this. But the government, in addition to extending TPS for those who already have it, can do something called redesignating it, which is like saying once more, starting over again. And what that does is it moves the arrival date by which people had to have arrived in the United States forward. And that's what they did last night. They said, now if you've arrived before July of 2023, you can apply for temporary protected status and work authorization. And the estimates are that that could allow another 470,000 or more Venezuelans who have arrived since that original TPS designation to apply for work authorization. Now, that's a lot of cases to add to the USCIS backlog, but they're trying to do some other things to streamline things on that end. So they decided that they're going to grant employment authorization for other categories of people who can get it for longer periods of time, so they don't have to renew so often. They're going to surge people to do these applications and kind of put them at the head of the line a little bit. So it will help, but it's a lot of work and it's not going to help immediately. But it's one of the things I think they finally said, okay, we can do this. One of the things that had kept them from doing it earlier was the perception, and this is not necessarily really incorrect, that by doing this, it will encourage more Venezuelans to come. And I think many in the immigration advocacy world would not like to acknowledge this, but it is true. So this is a kind of double-edged policy sword, if you will. It will help those who are already in the United States, again, with the government's permission, to work and support themselves, not rely on government services while their case is making its way. But it is likely to encourage more Venezuelans to come, even if they're not immediately eligible for TPS because they've arrived after the date. In some sense, it will be, well, if you come, there's a decent chance the government will move that date forward again in the future and you'll be able to work. So I think that it's one of those cases where the government tries to figure out, how do we balance what's the balance of equities here? What's our primary purpose? And I do think that they were influenced by the fact that it was Democratic mayors, Democratic governors, Democratic members of Congress who were criticizing them over this. And I think that probably influenced their decision ultimately.
Well, Theresa, what about the monetary costs to these receiving cities? Is the federal government providing any assistance, or are these cities kind of bearing the brunt of all of this on their own?
So I talked already about the FEMA grant program, the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, and now the Shelter and Services Program. These are federally government grants that cities have to request them. They can be reimbursed for costs, but they don't fund things initially. And even though there's some $400 million, I think, that was put into this program, Governor Adams says that his city has spent all $12 billion on caring and housing migrants already. Now, some people are questioning those data. I can't speak to his accounting, but what I will say is if you add up, what New York City may have spent, Chicago, Denver, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and all of the cities along the border, El Paso, McAllen, Del Rio, Eagle Pass, Yuma, Arizona, San Diego, they're all asking for this pot of money. It's not covering everything. And so it is a monetary cost. And again, to the extent that the migrants can start working and supporting themselves, that will help reduce those costs over time. But these initial outlays have been substantial.
I think in both issues that we've covered today, we've talked a lot about how the the courts and the administration have been responding to the migration crisis, but notably, we haven't mentioned action from Congress. So, Theresa, do you think these issues could push Congress to legislate finally and address this crisis?
So the short answer is yes, but I couldn't tell you when. Um,
Yeah.
you know, at the end of the day, there's two responsibilities that Congress has here. One is funding, right? They fund the federal government, and right now they're having a challenging time funding the government after September 30th of this year when the new fiscal year starts. They haven't yet passed the appropriations bills. That's not sure whether they're going to pass a continuing resolution. They're having a hard time figuring out how they're going to fund the government, which is one of the basic responsibilities of Congress. So, like, that's responsibility number one, like fund the government. The second thing is that, as I mentioned, a lot of the underlying issues of why our immigration system is so overwhelmed at the border right now do have to do with the way our law was designed, and where asylum seekers, non-Mexican arrivals at the border were treated as a small exception to the fact that migration was seen as a fundamentally Mexican issue at the border. And as I said it before, our law, our systems, our processes, and our infrastructure were designed when most migrants were trying to evade detection, sneak into the country, and work. So everybody we caught immediately was deportable. And they could be deported quickly back to Mexico. That does not describe the asylum seekers, the families who are coming from places other than Mexico, especially from countries that we don't have a relationship with, that we can deport them even if they are deportable. And we can't say they're deportable until we decide if they get asylum, right? So all of that, and the numbers and the arrivals and the time frame which they've come has just overwhelmed that system. Congress needs to address that, and they need to address it in a way that can pass the House, the Senate, and be signed by the president. And that means it has to be bipartisan. There are a lot of areas where Congress over years and years and years has debated bills, and in some cases gotten close to passing bills on other parts of the immigration system, whether it's legalization, whether it's changing the legal immigration system. And I think the universe of likely consensus, or at least policy compromises that people are willing to accept on those, are well known. This border situation is so new. I mean, it's a decade old, but it's new in the history of border enforcement. And it is so different than what we had seen before. Previously, the consensus about what we needed to do at the border essentially was more Border Patrol agents, more fencing, employment verification to prevent people from working illegally. But what we've seen is, even when we have done all of that, and by the way, we have more border agents than ever before, we have more technology, more border infrastructure than ever before. Employer sanctions is still a relative thing, but that doesn't matter if somebody's asking for asylum, because the law allows them to do that. And we've already talked about the desperation of the migrants that are coming. And so I do think that we need a new consensus built around what managing migration at the border, or border enforcement, or immigration enforcement, or whatever term we want to call it, looks like for this new reality, because it is a new reality. And we don't have that consensus yet. Republicans and Democrats have not yet had enough time, or frankly have had enough conversations with each other. And I think even within Republicans and Democrats on their own side of the aisle, there's not necessarily a sense of what really they need or ask for. And so we don't have a policy consensus, and that makes it hard for Congress to legislate. But that's really what has to happen to really get to what we do about this.
Well, before we close out, we have one big issue left to discuss, and that's this looming government shutdown on October 1st. Among a host of issue areas, a government shutdown would have implications for DHS and the border. But before we wrap up, I want to talk quickly about what those impacts might be. So let's start with USCIS. How are immigration services at this agency impacted? And what does that mean for our already overwhelming visa backlog?
So The good news is that USCIS is primarily funded by fees paid by applicants to process their applications. That money goes into something called the Immigration Examinations Fee Account. And even though Congress sort of appropriates money in advance of those fees, USCIS can operate as if those fees were received on time. So they can continue to process because the majority of what they do is not subject to that annual appropriations. It's funded by fees. So there are some headquarters positions and some positions that may not cover under that, but the large majority of USCIS adjudications can continue even if there is a lapse in government funding.
Now, what about CBP? We know that during a government shutdown, federal workers who are deemed essential continue to work. Are CBP officials considered essential at the border, and how is law enforcement at the border impacted, if at all?
Yeah. So there's two classifications of people who can keep working during a government shutdown. One is those who are exempt. And exempt are, as I mentioned, those who are working under fee-funded or non-appropriated money, or when there's appropriations that cross over fiscal years. Sometimes government agencies can get money that is multi-year money, so they can keep spending that money until it's gone over fiscal years. Then there's what's called accepted or essential workers, basically, and those are people who are they're paid out of appropriated money, but their functions are essential to security, safety, and protection of life. And so that does include law enforcement and immigration enforcement at the border. So most of CBP, particularly CBP at the border, Border Patrol, OFO, will continue to work during a shutdown. The main difference for them is that the people who can work under money that's available to keep getting spent get paid. Those people don't get paid until the government reopens and Congress authorizes them to get back pay. So they will be working without paychecks, but they will be working.
What about ICE? Are their operations affected at all?
ICE is similar to CBP in that the work they do primarily is seen as essential to security, life, or protection of life, or essential services. So again, the majority of ICE will remain on duty as well. They can continue to conduct enforcement and removal operations, although probably the scale will go back, will draw down a little bit.
As far as the shutdown and immigration are concerned, are there any other issues or potential implications that you think our listeners should be aware of?
Well, what I will say is that anytime there is a government shutdown, it is hugely disruptive to federal government operations. So even though people are on the job and they continue to do their job, there's not a lot of headquarters people are deemed as non-essential. They don't have all the support and backup. And again, they're working without getting paid. That puts a stress on them and their families and the communities they live in, because that money's not coming in the communities. They live in working communities, and that supports local economies. So it's not, even though we say those functions continue and they keep working, it's not as if a government shutdown means nothing. It does. Yeah. It's significant. It also means that they can't launch new things. They can only kind of keep everything going at the same level it's been going. So, for example, if we have another large surge of numbers of people coming in that requires redirection of other resources, that might be considered essential. They may be able to do it, but they have fewer places to pull from. So it's just worth understanding that even though some of these things will continue on, it really is severely disruptive to these agencies to have to go through a shutdown.
Theresa, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast to break down all of these issues. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
To our listeners, we'll see you next time on This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all of the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown. Send your comments and feedback to us at immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Hanadi Jordan. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Sneha Puri, Emily Vasquez, Hanadi Jordan, and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.